A warm welcome once again. I'm Joke Rogers. A Russian court has charged 4 men with acts of terrorism following a concert hall attack in Moscow. According to authorities, 4 gunmen stormed the Crocus City Hall on Friday night in northern Moscow and began firing on some of the estimated 6,000 people who were attending a rock concert. The attackers also set fire, which engulfed the venue and caused the roof to collapse. That attack left 137 people killed and more than 100 injured. The men, which appeared with beaten bruises, were identified as citizens of Tajikistan. They are to be held in pre-trial detention until May the 22nd. While the Islamic State group initially claimed responsibility for Friday's attack, Russian officials have claimed without evidence Ukrainian involvement. Well, many are still mourning in Russia and still in shock, trying to make sense of Friday's disaster. Residents in Moscow and foreigners laid flowers outside Crocus City Hall to pay tributes to the victims of the deadly attack.
Indeed, the Russian president says all 4 gunmen who carried out the attack on Crocus City Hall have been arrested. During his televised address on Saturday, he condemned the massacre, the deadliest Russia has seen in nearly 20 years. The president described it as a barbaric terrorist act and repeated earlier suggestions by Russian security services that the attackers had tried to escape to Ukraine. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has debunked the claims of Ukraine's involvement in the attack and described the Russian president and others in Moscow as scum for linking the attack to Kyiv. He suggested that the Russian leader was more concerned about pinning the attack on Kyiv than reassuring his own citizens. All morning on Sunday, Moscow residents lined up to lay flowers outside Crocus City Hall, where up to 6,200 people had gathered on Friday night for a rock concert by veteran band Picnic when the shooting started. Crocus City Hall is one of the most prominent music venues in Russia. Across the country, the Russian tricolour is flying at half-mast. Entertainment and sports events have been cancelled, and TV anchors are wearing black. People have also been leaving messages, some addressing the attackers, the majority of mourners shocked and heartbroken. Across the world, tributes have also been pouring in for victims of the attack at Russian embassies.
Нет? 4 марта? Да. Что в Турции делал?
In a video published on Russian media outlets on Saturday, 2 suspects in the attack who were detained by Russian law enforcement were seen being interrogated. One of them asserted he had been swayed by a preacher on a Telegram channel, whose assistant sent him a message a month ago and instructed him. Responding to the question of who exactly he was ordered to kill, he said he was told, "Doesn't matter, it will come to that. Do the job."
Ты сам их искал, или они тебя нашли?
Нет, они мне написали.
А почему они именно тебе написали?
Не знаю, я слушал там уроки.
The second suspect says he intended to work as a taxi driver in Moscow alongside a person named Abdullah, with whom he got acquainted on Telegram.
In the meantime, the United Nations has condemned last week's waves of Russian attacks on Ukraine, saying the strike is unacceptable. The attack, at least 4 killed, 14 others injured, and over 1 million Ukrainians are now without power.
This council once again meets against the devastating backdrop of war in Ukraine, with peace very clearly continuing to elude us. Just this morning, reports emerged of a massive wave of missile and drone attacks targeting power facilities in Ukraine, including in the country's second largest city, Kharkiv, leaving more than 1 million people without power. There are also reports of impact on water supply. The scale and scope of this devastation are appalling. The targeting of energy infrastructure, providing essential public services, is a black and white issue. It is simply unacceptable. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must not be the targets of indiscriminate attacks. All parties to any armed conflict have a duty to protect civilians in armed conflict and to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. This large-scale destruction and human suffering cannot continue. Reports related to the use of anti-personnel landmines and the transfer and use of cluster munitions in Ukraine are deeply concerning. Anti-personnel mines, with their inherently indiscriminate nature, have no place in our world. Their eradication is imperative, and their use must be unequivocally condemned.
Well, hundreds marched in the Serbian capital Belgrade on Sunday to mark the 25th anniversary of the NATO-led bombing campaign against former Yugoslavia, calling on the government to cut its ties with the organization. Protesters walked through the streets waving Serbian and anti-NATO flags. They gathered in front of the Belgrade Parliament building and a former military headquarters destroyed by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO-led bombing campaign of Yugoslavia lasted from March 24, 1999 until June 10 the same year without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. The alliance maintains it intervened to stop bloodshed and save lives, as well as prevent ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. The Yugoslav army withdrew from Kosovo and Metohija, and shortly after, over 160,000 Serbs from Kosovo left the region. Kosovo unilaterally declared independence in 2008. NATO has admitted that depleted uranium weapons were used in the 1999 conflict. However, the US-led military alliance has denied any link between the munitions and health issues, although some subsequent studies have linked it to birth defects and increased risks of certain cancers. In February this year, the United Nations World Food Programme announced the donation of 25,000 tons of wheat from the Ukrainian government. The wheat is expected to help provide emergency food assistance to 1.3 million crisis-affected people in the nation's northeast. The donation is also part of Ukraine's humanitarian Grain from Ukraine initiative launched by President Volodymyr Zelensky. Just as a reminder that the shipment was made possible by a collaborative effort from the United Kingdom, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Luxembourg, Norway, the Republic of Korea, and Sweden, which has helped cover the costs of transporting the wheat from Ukraine to Nigeria and its distribution. Joining us now on the program to discuss this goodwill towards Nigeria's ambassador for the Grain from Ukraine program and regional director for Central and West Africa programs at the National Democratic Institute in Washington, D.C., Dr. Christopher Fombio. Great to have you on the program today.
Thanks for having me, UK.
Right, so earlier this year, the Ukrainian government announced it had donated 25,000 tons of wheat to Nigeria, and this through the United Nations World Food Programme. Ukraine, a country in the middle of a war with Russia. How is the donation of wheat helpful at this time?
Well, you may be aware of the fact that Ukraine is the fifth, prior to the war in 2022, Ukraine was the fifth largest producer of wheat around the world, of grain. And so it has a considerable amount of stock. And because of that war, which is impacting countries across the globe, we've seen the rise in food crisis. We've also seen populations that are now exposed, some to conflict, some to the impact of climate change, that are vulnerable to food insecurity. And so Ukraine made a commitment through the Black Sea Agreement to participate in a humanitarian gesture to alleviate food insecurity around the globe. And Nigeria now happens to be one of the countries that benefited from the initiative destined for vulnerable populations in the northeastern part of the country impacted by the Boko Haram crisis and drought.
And how is Ukraine able to ship, wheat out despite bombardment from Russia?
You're very right. It's true that Odessa, which is the seaport that facilitated a lot of the shipment, has come under a lot of attacks from Russia, that some of its infrastructure has been destroyed. And Ukraine is now using alternate routes with assistance from some of the neighboring countries to get its grain out through countries like Moldova that share a border and other countries in Western Europe that facilitate the continuous shipment of grain from Ukraine to countries in the world and populations that are in need.
And, the donation, we understand, is going to 1.3 million people affected by crisis in the north. What's the plan for the distribution?
Indeed, the distribution is going to be done by the World Food Program, which has an established office and network in Nigeria, which already submitted a plan to make sure that that donation gets to the most vulnerable communities. And so with the infrastructure that the World Food Program already has inside Nigeria, that distribution is going to be able to happen. I had the good fortune of visiting with the officials of the World Food Program in Abuja a month ago, and got briefed on the steps that were being taken as the ship was unloading the grain at the port of Port Harcourt around mid-February 2024.
And we understand that, the initiative, by Ukraine was launched in 2022, barely 2 years ago. What other countries are expected to receive wheat donations from Ukraine? Some countries in Africa, I know, but, can we map out those countries and, when are they expected to receive their shipments?
Sure. The list of countries that would want to benefit from this initiative is pretty long, surprisingly, but in some ways it also translates the pressures of food insecurity that are being felt globally, not just in Africa, but even globally. And so far, the African countries that have benefited would include Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya. I was in Mombasa in March of 2024 for the Kenyan delivery, recently Sudan as well, and now Nigeria. But there are a number of other African countries that are on the list, including countries such as Mozambique and Malawi that were impacted by this cyclone Freddy not too long ago.
And is this initiative solely a Ukrainian effort?
Well, it's a combination of first the grain from Ukrainian farmers and the government of Ukraine, but also a collaborative effort from a number of countries, allies to Ukraine, that are willing, and development partners that are willing to make resources available to cover the cost of the grain as well as the transportation, so that by the end of the day, it arrives those communities at no cost, either to the host government or to those communities as well. So it's a real, genuine, collaborative effort that reinforces goodwill and humanitarian initiatives, despite Ukraine being in a state of war imposed upon it by Russia.
Will there be more donations from Ukraine in the near future?
I hope so, because in November of 2023, when the second Global Food Summit took place in Ukraine, in Kiev, Ukraine, President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, committed to continue to maintain the humanitarian effort and, in fact, to foster it and to be responsive despite the challenges of the moment. And I'm sure that with the collaboration of other countries that are providing alternate routes to get this grain to the needy countries, that countries such as Sudan and even Yemen in the Middle East would continue to benefit from this humanitarian endeavor on the part of Ukraine.
Ambassador, there's a list of countries, that you just mentioned that will benefit from the, shipment from Ukraine. There's also a list of countries that are supporting Ukraine to get this done. We've listed the United Kingdom, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Luxembourg, Norway, the Republic of Korea, as well as Sweden, helping, this humanitarian effort when, Ukraine itself is in need of a lot of humanitarian effort due to the bombardment from Russia. How is it able to, do the double work of getting this done when it's also needing a lot of help itself?
Well, that's a very powerful story, and that's part of the story of Ukraine that I hope that the world will get to know and to understand that the people at risk of loss of life to themselves are still able to meet their commitments on the humanitarian side. I was in Ukraine, I was in Kiev, Ukraine in November of 2023, and I saw for myself firsthand the risk of living in a country at war and the risk of having missiles and drones, shot at, the capital city, Kiev, the weekend that I was there. And to see for myself that despite these challenges, the people and government of Ukraine are keeping to their commitments on the humanitarian side. And I think this is a wake-up call to all of us as part of humanity, global humanity, to recognize that this war is not only putting at risk the populations and the people of Ukraine, but it's impacting other countries and vulnerable populations across the globe. And it's about time that the world moves collectively to bring this senseless war and this senseless aggression from Russia to an end.
Right. Dr. Christopher Fomunyo, Ambassador for the Grain from Ukraine program, thank you for your time today on the program.
Thanks for having me.